This is a story you won't forget. It begins with a decision, one that would send shockwaves through an entire nation. Imagine a president who uncovers a devastating truth. His most trusted ministers, handpicked to serve and protect the country, are secretly running one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking operations in all of West Africa. What does a leader do when corruption isn't out there, but inside the very heart of his own government? How far would you go when the betrayal is personal? In the next few minutes, you'll witness a tale of loyalty shattered, justice pursued, and a president who made an unthinkable choice to declare war on his own cabinet. But here's the question that lingers long after the final arrest. Was this truly about justice or something far more calculated? The truth might leave you speechless. It was 11:47 p.m. when President Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in his study, the air heavy with silence. Scattered across his mahogany desk were surveillance photographs, each one a snapshot of betrayal, each one a wound. These weren't foreign spies or insurgents. No, the faces staring back at him were his own ministers, men he had appointed, men who swore loyalty, men who had promised to serve the people of Burkina Faso. But loyalty, as he now saw, had a price tag, 2.3 million euros per shipment. The photos said it all. Luxury cars beyond any official salary, secret rendezvous in crumbling warehouses, handshakes with Colombian cartel operatives. There were bank records, phone taps, and cover-ups. What appeared to be shipments of medical supplies were actually massive drug hauls, cocaine disguised as aid, worth more than the entire national healthcare budget. For 43 days, Traoré carried the burden alone, 43 nights without sleep, planning, watching, preparing. Because when your house is built on rot, you either look away or you burn it down. He had chosen fire. The intelligence came from an unlikely source, a dying man's confession. Colonel Sadu, a decorated border guard, was shot during what was supposed to be a routine inspection. As he lay in a military hospital, fading fast, he grabbed Traoré's wrist with surprising strength and whispered 4 words that would change everything. "They're all in on it." Traoré hesitated, thinking it was just the delirium of a dying soldier, until Sadu forced a small memory card into his hand. "Everything's on there," he gasped. "Every name, every transaction, every lie." 3 hours later, Sadu was dead. Officially, he succumbed to his wounds, but Traoré knew better. The timing was too perfect, the scene too clean. Someone wanted Sadu silenced, but they were too late. The memory card held 18 months of evidence, wire transfers, voice recordings, surveillance footage. It was all there, undeniable, damning, and explosive. The Minister of Health was using aid trucks to ferry cocaine. The Minister of Transport provided official vehicles and forged documents. The Minister of Commerce laundered drug money through shell companies. This wasn't petty theft. It was a state-sponsored drug empire, operating with the full power and protection of the cabinet. Worse yet, they'd been doing it while sitting in anti-corruption meetings with straight faces, talking about poverty and progress as they sold the country piece by piece. But what haunted Traoré most were the deaths, because behind every euro was a life destroyed. Villagers murdered for refusing cooperation, local chiefs vanished for asking too many questions, border agents like Colonel Sadu who were accidentally killed. This wasn't just corruption, it was blood money, and the stain reached all the way to the top. The president knew the risks. He knew that tomorrow would define his legacy or end it. He quietly built a team of loyal operatives, men and women untouched by the rot, people whose allegiance was not to politics, but to the people of Burkina Faso. The plan had to be swift, precise, brutal. At exactly 8 a.m., he would call an emergency cabinet meeting under the guise of a national security briefing. At that same moment, his special units, stationed across the country, would launch synchronized raids, homes, warehouses, financial fronts. Every piece of the network would be taken down in one coordinated strike. Evidence had to be seized before it was destroyed. Bank accounts frozen before funds disappeared offshore. And most of all, the ministers arrested before they could vanish into the very underworld they helped create. Traoré had studied the failures of other African leaders, those who tried to clean house but hesitated, made deals, or sent warnings too early. He would not make that mistake. No negotiations, no half measures, no compromises, only justice. But justice, he knew, demands a price. As the first light of dawn spilled across the palace windows, Traoré stood, his face hard with resolve. Every detail was etched into his mind, every lie, every name, every betrayal. Today, he would do the unthinkable. Today, the president of Burkina Faso would arrest his own ministers on live television if necessary, on charges of high treason, drug trafficking, and crimes against the people. He would prove, once and for all, that in the new Burkina Faso, no one was above the law. Not even the men who helped write it. But first, he had to survive the next 12 hours. At exactly 1:17 a.m., while President Traoré was still hunched over evidence in his study, the first phase of his plan had already begun. In the quiet darkness of Bobo-Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's second-largest city, a convoy of unmarked vehicles slipped silently through the streets. No sirens, no lights, just precision, purpose, and the weight of secrets that had taken weeks to uncover. Leading the operation was Colonel Diba, a man whose history with Traoré was nothing but simple. 2 years earlier, Diba had been publicly demoted for conduct unbecoming. That was the official story. The truth, he had challenged Traoré's military strategy during a cabinet meeting, an act many viewed as insubordination. Traoré had seen arrogance, but now he saw something more important: incorruptibility. In a government riddled with compromise, Diba's unwavering integrity made him essential. His fall from grace also made him invisible, a perfect ghost to lead the president's most critical mission. The convoy's target was a warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. Officially, it was a medical supply distribution center under the Ministry of Health, serving rural clinics, saving lives. Unofficially, it was a front for one of West Africa's most powerful cocaine distribution hubs. As the convoy approached, Diba reviewed the operation one last time. His team had drilled for 2 weeks, clearing rooms, preserving evidence, anticipating violence. They knew this warehouse was heavily guarded. They also knew they had one shot. Traoré had been clear: secure the evidence first. Everything else came second. At 1:43 a.m., they arrived. From the outside, the facade looked as wholesome as its mission: government signage, official license plates, a garden by the gate. But to Diba's trained eye, that facade was more dangerous than any weapon. Because the more convincing the lie, the harder it is to tear down. The raid was swift and surgical. In under 90 seconds, the perimeter was secured. Within 3 minutes, 6 armed guards were neutralized without a single fatality. What they discovered inside chilled even Diba's hardened instincts. This wasn't just a storage site. It was a fully functioning cocaine processing facility. Advanced chemistry labs, automated packaging lines, raw materials worth millions. The operation was so well built, it rivaled pharmaceutical factories in Europe. And worse, hidden in containers labeled as vaccines and emergency medicines were false compartments packed with pure cocaine, bound for Europe. Those containers were sealed with government stamps, each one a mockery of the trust placed in the institutions of Burkina Faso. As Diba's team documented the scene, they found something even more damning. Government files, real documents, stamped and signed, falsified orders for non-existent medical supplies, transportation clearances for phantom convoys, budgets never approved but fully spent. This wasn't passive complicity. The ministers had built the operation themselves. The plan had to be swift, precise, brutal. At exactly 8 a.m., he would call an emergency cabinet meeting under the guise of a national security briefing. At that same moment, his special units, stationed across the country, would launch synchronized raids, homes, warehouses, financial fronts. Every piece of the network would be taken down in one coordinated strike. Evidence had to be seized before it was destroyed. Bank accounts frozen before funds disappeared offshore. And most of all, the ministers arrested before they could vanish into the very underworld they helped create. Traoré had studied the failures of other African leaders, those who tried to clean house but hesitated, made deals, or sent warnings too early. He would not make that mistake. No negotiations, no half measures, no compromises, only justice. But justice, he knew, demands a price. As the first light of dawn spilled across the palace windows, Traoré stood, his face hard with resolve. Every detail was etched into his mind, every lie, every name, every betrayal. Today, he would do the unthinkable. Today, the president of Burkina Faso would arrest his own ministers on live television if necessary, on charges of high treason, drug trafficking, and crimes against the people. He would prove, once and for all, that in the new Burkina Faso, no one was above the law. Not even the men who helped write it. But first, he had to survive the next 12 hours. At exactly 1:17 a.m., while President Traoré was still hunched over evidence in his study, the first phase of his plan had already begun. In the quiet darkness of Bobo-Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's second-largest city, a convoy of unmarked vehicles slipped silently through the streets. No sirens, no lights, just precision, purpose, and the weight of secrets that had taken weeks to uncover. Leading the operation was Colonel Diba, a man whose history with Traoré was nothing but simple. 2 years earlier, Diba had been publicly demoted for conduct unbecoming. That was the official story. The truth, he had challenged Traoré's military strategy during a cabinet meeting, an act many viewed as insubordination. Traoré had seen arrogance, but now he saw something more important: incorruptibility. In a government riddled with compromise, Diba's unwavering integrity made him essential. His fall from grace also made him invisible, a perfect ghost to lead the president's most critical mission. The convoy's target was a warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. Officially, it was a medical supply distribution center under the Ministry of Health, serving rural clinics, saving lives. Unofficially, it was a front for one of West Africa's most powerful cocaine distribution hubs. As the convoy approached, Debo reviewed the operation one last time. His team had drilled for 2 weeks, clearing rooms, preserving evidence, anticipating violence. They knew this warehouse was heavily guarded. They also knew they had one shot. Traoré had been clear. Secure the evidence first. Everything else came second. At 1:43 a.m., they arrived. From the outside, the facade looked as wholesome as its mission: government signage, official license plates, a garden by the gate. But to Debo's trained eye, that facade was more dangerous than any weapon. Because the more convincing the lie, the harder it is to tear down. The raid was swift and surgical. In under 90 seconds, the perimeter was secured. Within 3 minutes, 6 armed guards were neutralized without a single fatality. What they discovered inside chilled even Debo's hardened instincts. This wasn't just a storage site. It was a fully functioning cocaine processing facility. Advanced chemistry labs, automated packaging lines, raw materials worth millions. The operation was so well built, it rivaled pharmaceutical factories in Europe. And worse, hidden in containers labeled as vaccines and emergency medicines were false compartments packed with pure cocaine, bound for Europe. Those containers were sealed with government stamps, each one a mockery of the trust placed in the institutions of Burkina Faso. As Debo's team documented the scene, they found something even more damning. Government files, real documents, stamped and signed, falsified orders for non-existent medical supplies, transportation clearances for phantom convoys, budgets never approved but fully spent. This wasn't passive complicity. The ministers had built the operation themselves. And then, tucked in the back of the warehouse, they found the smoking gun, a locked filing cabinet filled with meticulous financial records. It was all there: percentages, payoffs, offshore accounts. 30% of profits went to South American suppliers, 20% covered logistics, and 30%, millions, flowed directly into private bank accounts held by 3 Burkina ministers. It was a prosecutor's dream: every transaction recorded, every recipient named. They weren't hiding it. They believed they were untouchable. By 2:05 a.m., Daiba had everything he needed to bury the conspirators. But time was slipping away. One more detail raised the stakes higher than ever: a shipment manifest. A massive cocaine delivery was set to arrive within 6 hours. If the ministers caught wind of the raid, they'd cancel the shipment, erase the evidence, and disappear. Worse, they'd eliminate any loose ends, including the president. Daiba called Traoré on an encrypted line. The call lasted 47 seconds. When it ended, both men understood the stakes. They had 7 hours to bring down an empire, or be buried by it. At 6:30 a.m., 5 government ministers received identical calls from the presidential palace. Each was summoned to an emergency cabinet meeting. The tone was urgent, but routine. Burkina Faso had seen its share of emergencies. No one suspected a trap. What they didn't know is that every call was monitored and recorded. And what 3 of them couldn't know was that this would be their final cabinet meeting. The first to arrive was Dr. Marie Kobore, Minister of Healthcare. Known as a tireless advocate for rural healthcare, she had built a public image of sacrifice and service. But Traoré now knew the truth. She had sold vaccines on the black market and diverted critical supplies to fund her role in the drug trade. Children had died from treatable diseases, mothers bled out in childbirth for lack of basic tools. And behind the suffering was Traoré, pocketing blood money and calling it policy. 10 minutes later, the Minister of Transport arrived, Umaru Sawadogu. To Traoré, this betrayal hit hardest. Umaru was the younger brother of Colonel Sadu, the very man who had died to expose the conspiracy. While one brother bled out on a hospital bed whispering the truth, the other was forging transport permits and clearing the roads for drug convoys. It was almost poetic in its cruelty. Two brothers, one fighting for justice, the other selling out his nation. And by 8 a.m., they would all be seated at the same table, unaware that justice was about to arrive from within their own house. The last to arrive was Minister of Commerce Abdul Traoré. And of all the ministers, he was by far the most dangerous. While others had fallen into the conspiracy out of greed, fear, or weakness, Traoré was the architect. He had been there from the beginning. He was the one who established contact with the South American cartels. He designed the laundering schemes, recruited the others, and convinced them their crimes were harmless. But Traoré was also the man who had ordered the death of Colonel Sadu, the very man who had dared to expose the truth. As the ministers gathered in the conference room of the presidential palace, they suspected nothing. They chatted casually, completely unaware that every word they spoke was being recorded. Every phone call for the past several weeks had been monitored, and every financial move they had made had already been traced and analyzed. They still believed they were untouchable, that their government positions gave them immunity, that their president lacked the will to act against them. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. At 8 a.m., President Traoré entered the room alone. The ministers noted his solitary entrance, unusual but not alarming. What was unsettling, however, was his demeanor. The normally expressive, animated leader now stood cold and still. No smiles, no greetings. His eyes, usually warm, were now distant, sharp, calculating. He took his seat at the head of the table. Silence followed. Seconds passed, then a minute, then two. Finally, Traoré broke the silence. "Do you know what betrayal smells like?" he asked, his voice calm but icy. The question lingered in the air like gunpowder. Dr. Traoré was the first to respond. "Mr. President, I don't understand. What betrayal?" Traoré's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you understand perfectly, Doctor, just as Minister Sawadogu understands, just as Minister Traoré understands." The named ministers froze. Their expressions didn't betray much. They had been trained for pressure. But Traoré wasn't looking for obvious tells. He had spent weeks studying them, watching how they reacted under scrutiny, learning their lies. He saw Traoré's left eye twitch, a signal he was already planning his exit. He saw Sawadogu swallow hard, barely perceptible panic. He saw Dr. Traoré breathing evenly, ready to deny everything. But no denial would matter now. At 8:15 a.m., the side door to the conference room opened. In walked Colonel Daiba, carrying a sealed briefcase and a laptop. Two tech specialists followed, setting up screens and audio equipment as the ministers looked on, confused and increasingly alarmed. "What's going on here?" Traoré demanded. "Why are we being filmed?" Traoré's voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. "Because the people of Burkina Faso deserve to see justice done. They need to know that no one in this government is above the law." Dioba placed a thick folder on the table in front of the accused ministers and opened the laptop, connecting it to the room's audio system. "What you're about to hear," Traoré said, are recordings of your conversations with members of a South American drug cartel. These were captured over the past 18 months as part of a covert investigation. The first recording played. It was Traoré's voice, unmistakable, speaking with a man who had a Colombian accent, discussing cocaine shipments, routes, payment terms. The quality was clear, the content devastating. Color drained from Traoré's face. He had always been careful, used coded language, encrypted channels, but none of that had protected him from Traoré's intelligence operation. Then came the second recording. Dr. Traoré coolly discussing how vaccine shipments to rural clinics could be adjusted to make room for cocaine. She sounded calm, clinical, even proud. Then the third. Minister Ouagadougou giving out patrol schedules and checkpoint locations, details that had allowed traffickers to bypass national security undetected. He had, quite literally, sold his country's borders. By the time the final recording ended, the room was silent. The ministers looked stunned, pale, as if they had just witnessed their own political funerals. But Traoré wasn't done. Colonel Dioba pulled out another stack of documents, bank records, wire transfers, and offshore account statements. The paper trail was thorough and damning. You've received over 47 million euros from these operations, money used to buy estates in Europe, luxury vehicles, and investments in foreign markets. He paused, letting the magnitude sink in. And while you were doing this, the Ministry of Health was reporting vaccine shortages. The Ministry of Transport said there wasn't enough money to fix rural bridges. The Ministry of Commerce claimed it couldn't support local farmers or cooperatives. He looked each of them in the eyes. You didn't just rob this country, you sold it, piece by piece, while the people you were sworn to serve suffered. Traoré finally spoke, but his voice was weak, cracking under pressure. Mr. President, I can explain. These recordings, taken out of context. The money, it's not what it looks like. Traoré stood slowly. No, he said. It's exactly what it looks like. Traoré let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Really, Minister? Then please explain the context that makes selling your country to drug cartels acceptable. Explain how stealing medicine from dying children was somehow a patriotic act. Dr. Traoré tried a new tactic. Her tone softened, diplomatic. Mr. President, even if these allegations were true, we must consider the broader picture. The funds we received were reinvested into development. We were finding creative solutions to our financial crisis. The audacity stunned the room. She was trying to reframe her role in a drug trafficking empire as patriotic innovation, a noble workaround to economic hardship. But Traoré didn't flinch. Doctor, he said, his voice sharp and surgical, the only development project you funded was a luxury villa in Monaco, and the only people who benefited from your creativity were Colombian drug lords and European money launderers. Minister Ouagadougou sat in silence, saying nothing. Unlike his colleagues, who still clung to denial, he seemed to understand the full gravity of what was unfolding. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a meticulously planned takedown. There would be no negotiations, no backroom deals, no easy exits. Justice had arrived, and it wasn't leaving quietly. At exactly 9:01 a.m., the doors opened once again. 6 operatives in unmarked tactical uniforms stepped into the room. No badges, no names, just silent precision and trained authority. They took positions around the conference table, 2 assigned to each of the accused ministers. Traoré rose to his feet, his voice steady as a verdict. Marie Traoré, Umaru Ouagadougou, Abdul Traoré, You are under arrest for high treason, drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy against the state of Burkina Faso." The room went still. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The magnitude of the moment seemed to freeze time. Then Traoré made a desperate move. He shoved his chair back and bolted for the nearest exit. But he didn't get far. He barely made 3 steps before 2 operatives tackled him hard to the floor and cuffed his wrists. His final act as a minister had been a failed escape, now with resisting arrest added to his growing list of charges. Dr. Traoré, by contrast, stood slowly. Her voice trembled, but her words carried pride. "Mr. President, I've served this country for 20 years. I've devoted my life to public health. I deserve better than this humiliation." Traoré met her eyes, his tone cold but resolute. "Doctor, you deserve exactly what you're getting. The people you betrayed deserved better than being sold for cartel money." But it was Minister Ouagadougou who surprised them all. As the operatives approached, he simply smiled, a quiet broken smile of regret. "I'm sorry, Mr. President," he said softly. "I'm sorry about my brother. I'm sorry for everything." For a moment, Traoré saw a flicker of the man Ouagadougou used to be, before ambition and greed swallowed him whole. But no apology, no matter how sincere, could undo the deaths, the pain, the betrayal. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Traoré felt a storm of emotions. Relief, justice, but also grief. Grief for the betrayal, for the country they could have built together, for the lives lost to their crimes. 2 other ministers, the Minister of Education and the Minister of Agriculture, remained seated in stunned silence. They had not been implicated, but they looked visibly shaken by what they had witnessed. Traoré turned to them. "You are free to go," he said, "but let me be perfectly clear. This government will not tolerate corruption at any level. If either of you has been involved in criminal activity, now is the time to come forward." Both ministers quickly assured him they had nothing to hide, but their voices shook. They had just seen what happens when power is abused, and they understood that their own careers now rested on absolute, unquestionable integrity. By 9:20 a.m., word of the arrests had leaked, and the country ignited. Within minutes, social media exploded, radio stations interrupted their programming, crowds gathered in markets, at bus stops, in schools and cafes. Shock came first, then disbelief, then an overwhelming wave of hope. Their president had just arrested his own ministers, not for show, not for politics, but for crimes against the people. He had chosen justice over loyalty. He had declared that, in this Burkina Faso, no one was above the law. It was a moment the nation hadn't seen in decades. In rural villages, where corruption had long been seen as inevitable, people dared to believe change was finally possible. The arrests weren't just a crackdown, they were a declaration, a turning point, a promise. But Traoré knew the real test still lay ahead. At 10:15 a.m., as the arrested ministers were being transported to secure detention centers, Traoré received a phone call he had been expecting. It was the French ambassador. "Mr. President," the ambassador said smoothly, "France is concerned by the dramatic events in your government this morning. We hope these arrests are based on real evidence, not political maneuvering." The implication was unmistakable. France suspected this was just another African leader using corruption charges to eliminate rivals. Traoré's answer was short and deadly clear. "This is war," and hung up. Because the ambassador's call had reminded him this wasn't just about domestic politics. His actions would be scrutinized by the world. And if he wanted to maintain international partnerships, he'd have to prove that this wasn't revenge, it was real reform. By 11 a.m., his government moved with force and speed. 4 corporate bank accounts linked to the conspiracy were frozen. Investigators traced payments directly from South American cartels to these shell companies. The takedown was underway. But this was just the beginning, and President Traoré was no longer playing defense. He was taking his country back. By 11:30 a.m., the crackdown reached the skies. 2 airstrips, previously approved by the Ministry of Transport under the guise of agricultural development, were shut down by elite military units. Inside the hangars, investigators uncovered unmarked aircraft equipped with navigation systems programmed to avoid radar detection and official border crossings. These weren't crop dusters, they were cocaine couriers, flying from South America straight into West Africa's shadow economy. By 1 p.m., a high-ranking judge was suspended. He had quietly dismissed 5 major drug trafficking cases over the past year. Now it was clear why. Each defendant had ties to the same network that was paying off ministers. The rot wasn't just in politics, it had seeped into the justice system. But every action taken that day was precise, legally documented, and publicly reported. President Traoré wanted the world to understand this wasn't a purge, this wasn't political revenge, this was a lawful, surgical dismantling of institutionalized corruption. But the defining moment came at 2:47 p.m. President Traoré stood before the National Assembly, not with scripted remarks or prepared applause lines, but with fire in his eyes and truth on his tongue. "If anyone here believes they are above the law," he said calmly, "leave now. I won't ask twice." The chamber froze. No one moved. Not a chair creaked. Not a whisper. Not a cough. The silence was not just fear, it was realization. The culture of impunity that had ruled Burkina Faso for decades was being shattered. Right here, right now. Traoré continued, "For too long we have accepted corruption as normal. We have watched resources meant for our people be siphoned into private pockets. We've allowed criminals to wear suits and sit in these very chairs. That ends today." He scanned the room, his gaze falling deliberately on certain legislators, men and women whose reputations had long carried the stink of backroom deals. "I know some of you are afraid. You should be. If you have stolen from this country, if you have betrayed your office, you have every reason to fear what's coming." Then came the unexpected turn. "But I'm offering you a way out. Come forward, confess, return what you stole. Cooperate, and you will be treated with mercy. Mercy you never showed the people you robbed." It was unprecedented, an open offer of amnesty in exchange for confession and cooperation. "But if you hide, if you lie, if we have to dig up your crimes ourselves, then know this: the full weight of the law will fall upon you, and this time the law will not look away." The message was unmistakable. Cleanse yourself, or be cleansed by force. In the weeks that followed, the results spoke for themselves. 17 officials turned themselves in. Some confessed to bribery, others to embezzlement or selling government contracts to the highest bidder. None of their crimes rivaled the scale of the drug conspiracy, but all had contributed to the poverty and dysfunction plaguing the nation. Their confessions sparked a wave of reform. Financial transparency measures made it nearly impossible to hide transactions. Oversight bodies were empowered to track development funds. Ministries were held accountable not only for corruption but for performance. But the biggest shift wasn't legal, it was cultural. Traoré's arrests sent a signal that echoed through every office and village. Corruption was no longer a low-risk, high-reward game. It was now a gamble with everything to lose. 6 months later, the world was taking notice. Transparency International raised Burkina Faso's anti-corruption ranking by 15 points. The World Bank approved long-stalled development loans. Foreign investors returned with cautious optimism. And most importantly, ordinary citizens felt the change. In rural clinics, medical supplies arrived, on time and in full. Roads once abandoned were paved and repaired. School funds were used to build actual schools, not private estates. The drug network that had burrowed into the Ministry of Health was eradicated.